The road stretched out before her like a ribbon of grey silk, winding through the English countryside under a sky that couldn't decide between rain and forgiveness. It was late afternoon in the autumn of 1995, and the light had that particular quality, golden but fragile, as if it knew its time was short. Diana sat in the back seat of the dark sedan, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. She had just left a private engagement in Kent, something small and unofficial, the kind of visit that never made the papers because there were no photographers invited, no press releases prepared. Just her and a group of families who needed someone to listen, someone to see them. The car hummed quietly along the narrow country road, flanked on both sides by ancient hedgerows that had witnessed centuries of travelers. Her driver, a man who had worked with her for years and understood the value of silence, kept his eyes on the road. Her protection officer sat in the passenger seat, equally quiet, equally watchful. This was a part of her life Diana treasured most, the spaces between the spectacle. The moments when she could simply exist, moving through the world without the weight of 1,000 expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Out here, away from London, away from the palace walls and the camera flashes, she could almost remember who she used to be. The trees overhead formed a canopy, their branches reaching toward each other like old friends embracing. Leaves, copper and gold, drifted down in lazy spirals, landing softly on the windshield before being swept away by the wipers. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made Diana's mind wander to places she usually kept locked away. She thought about her sons, about the kind of world she wanted to leave them, about whether any of the work she was doing actually mattered, or if she was simply performing a role she'd never auditioned for, in a play that would continue long after she'd left the stage. The melancholy settled over her like a familiar blanket, not quite comfortable, but known. She'd learned to live with it, this quiet sadness that colored even her brightest moments. It was the price of caring too much in a world that often seemed designed to reward those who cared too little. The car slowed slightly as they rounded a bend. Diana barely noticed at first, still lost in her thoughts. But then the driver's posture changed, straightened. His hands adjusted their grip on the steering wheel. He said quietly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. Diana looked up. Through the windshield, she could see something ahead on the side of the road. A figure, small, crumpled against the hedgerow as if the world had simply forgotten them there. "Stop the car," Diana said. The protection officer turned slightly in his seat. We should stop the car, please." There was something in her voice, not commanding, but absolute, the kind of certainty that left no room for negotiation. The driver slowed, pulling carefully to the side of the narrow road. The engine idled, a quiet purr in the stillness of the countryside. Diana was already reaching for the door handle. "Let me check first," the protection officer said, moving to exit the vehicle. But Diana was faster. She stepped out onto the gravel shoulder, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. The autumn air wrapped around her, cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and approaching rain. The figure hadn't moved. From this distance, Diana could see it was a woman, elderly, perhaps in her 80s, sitting with her back against the hedgerow. Her coat was thin and worn, her hair a wisp of white escaping from beneath a faded headscarf. Beside her sat 2 plastic bags, their contents a mystery. Diana approached slowly, carefully, aware that sudden movements might frighten someone in distress. The protection officer followed a few steps behind, his trained eyes scanning the area, looking for threats that Diana had already decided didn't exist. As she drew closer, the woman looked up. Her eyes were pale blue, rheumy with age, but still sharp, still alive with something Diana recognized immediately, dignity clinging to itself in the face of circumstances that threatened to strip it away. "Hello," Diana said softly, kneeling down so she was at eye level with the woman. She didn't care that her expensive skirt was touching the damp ground, that mud was likely seeping into the fabric. None of that mattered. The woman blinked, confusion crossing her weathered face. "I'm all right," she said quickly, defensively. "Just resting. I'll be moving along." Diana's heart contracted. She'd heard that tone before, the voice of someone who'd learned not to ask for help, who'd been turned away too many times to believe that anyone would stop for them now. "I can see you're resting," Diana said gently. "But it's getting cold, and it looks like rain. May I ask, where are you headed?" The woman's jaw tightened. For a moment, Diana thought she might refuse to answer. But then something in her expression softened, perhaps recognizing something in Diana's eyes that told her this wasn't judgment or pity. It was genuine concern. "Home," the woman said finally. "Or what's left of it. Millbrook. About 3 miles up the road." Diana glanced back at the car, then at the woman's thin coat and worn shoes. 3 miles in this weather, at her age, carrying those bags. "What's your name?" Diana asked. The woman hesitated, then answered. "Margaret. Margaret Holloway." "Margaret," Diana repeated, as if committing it to memory. "I'm Diana. Would you allow me to give you a ride home? We're going that direction." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. She looked past Diana to the sleek black car, to the driver and protection officer who stood at a respectful distance, and then back to Diana's face. Really looked at it this time. And Diana saw the moment recognition dawned, a flicker of shock, quickly suppressed, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "You're—" Margaret started, then stopped, shook her head. No, I couldn't possibly." "You could," Diana said simply. "And I wish you would. It would make me happy to help." It was that last part that did it. Not the offer of help itself, but the vulnerability in Diana's voice. The suggestion that Margaret would be doing her a kindness by accepting. It was a reversal that Margaret hadn't expected, and it disarmed her completely. "My bags," Margaret said weakly. It's just some groceries. And some things from the charity shop. I don't want to dirty your car." Diana stood and reached for the bags without hesitation. They're perfect. Come on, let's get you warm." She helped Margaret to her feet, supporting her elbow as the older woman straightened with visible effort. Together, they walked slowly back to the car. The driver had already opened the back door, his face carefully neutral but his eyes betraying his surprise at what was unfolding. Diana guided Margaret into the back seat, making sure she was comfortable before walking around to enter from the other side. She slid in beside Margaret. The two women separated by less than a foot of leather upholstery, separated by a lifetime of different circumstances, yet connected by something more fundamental, their shared humanity. "Stay until the end. What happens next shows a side of Diana the world almost forgot." As the car pulled back onto the road, Diana turned slightly toward Margaret. "Is there a specific address in Millbrook?" Margaret gave directions in a voice that was barely above a whisper, as if she still couldn't quite believe this was happening. The protection officer entered the information into his mental map of the area, while the driver navigated smoothly back onto the country road. For the first few minutes, they rode in silence. Diana didn't push conversation. She understood that sometimes silence was its own form of respect, allowing someone to process the unexpected without the pressure of performing gratitude or explanation. But gradually, Margaret began to speak. Softly at first, then with growing confidence. "I used to drive this road myself," she said, looking out the window at the passing hedgerows. "Had a little Morris Minor. Blue. My husband bought it for me in 1962, just before our daughter was born. I drove it for 30 years before I had to give it up." Diana listened, giving Margaret her complete attention, something she'd learned was one of the greatest gifts you could offer another person. "He died 15 years ago, Margaret continued. My Thomas. Heart attack. Sudden. He was in the garden one moment, and then... She trailed off, the sentence completing itself in the silence. I'm so sorry, Diana said, and meant it with every fibre of her being. Margaret nodded, accepting the condolence. My daughter wants me to sell the house. Move into a home, she says. Says I can't manage on my own anymore. Her voice carried an edge of defiance. But that house, it's where we raised her. Where Thomas and I had our life. Every room has his fingerprints on it. He built the kitchen cabinets himself. Planted every tree in the garden. How do you sell that? How do you pack up a lifetime and pretend it's just furniture and walls? Diana understood that question more deeply than Margaret could know. She thought about her own life, about all the homes she'd lived in that had never quite felt like hers, about the possessions that came with expectations attached, about the gilded cage she'd spent years trying to escape. You don't, Diana said quietly. You don't pretend. And you don't let anyone tell you that your memories are worth less than their convenience. Margaret turned to look at her then, really look at her. You understand, she said, and it wasn't a question. More than you might think, Diana replied. The countryside continued to roll past, but inside the car, something had shifted. The formality had dissolved. They were no longer a princess and a subject, or a wealthy woman and someone in need. They were two women who knew what it meant to feel trapped by circumstances beyond their control, to fight for agency in a world that constantly tried to take it away. The groceries, Margaret said suddenly, as if just remembering them. I walk to the market because my neighbor usually gives me a ride, but she's away visiting family. I thought I could manage the walk both ways, but... She laughed softly. Sadly, I'm not as strong as I used to be. Halfway back, I had to stop. I told myself just for a minute, just to catch my breath. But then the minute became 10, and I started to worry I might not make it home at all. You would have, Diana said with gentle conviction. But I'm glad you didn't have to. Margaret reached over and placed her weathered hand on top of Diana's. The gesture was brief, lasting only a second, but the weight of it, the trust and gratitude and recognition it carried, settled over Diana like a benediction. You have kind eyes, Margaret said. I saw them right away, before I even knew who you were. You have the eyes of someone who's known pain. Real pain. Not the kind that makes you bitter, but the kind that makes you careful with other people's hearts. Diana felt tears prick her eyes but kept them at bay. Thank you, she whispered. They turned onto a narrower road, passing a row of modest cottages that looked like they'd been standing there since long before either of them was born. Margaret pointed to a small house at the end of the row, its garden overgrown but clearly loved, its windows glowing with the warm light of a single lamp left burning inside. That's mine, she said. Number 7. The car pulled into the small drive. Diana's protection officer exited first, quickly assessing the area, a habit so ingrained it was automatic, before opening Margaret's door. But Diana was already moving, exiting from her side and retrieving Margaret's bags from where they'd been carefully placed in the front passenger seat. She carried them to the front door and waited while Margaret fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly. Whether from cold, exhaustion, or emotion, Diana couldn't tell. Perhaps all three. The door swung open, revealing a small entryway that smelled of tea and old books and memories. Diana stepped inside without being asked, setting the bags down in the kitchen while Margaret stood in the doorway, looking uncertain. Let me help you put these away, Diana said, already unpacking the groceries with practiced efficiency. She found the proper places instinctively, bread in the bin, milk in the refrigerator, tins in the cupboard. Margaret watched in stunned silence as Diana moved through her kitchen, this woman who lived in palaces making herself at home among chipped mugs and mismatched dishes. It was surreal, impossible, and yet it was happening. When the groceries were stored away, Diana turned and really looked at Margaret in the light of her own home. She saw the exhaustion in her face, the relief at being somewhere safe, the lingering disbelief at how the afternoon had unfolded. "Do you have someone who checks on you?" Diana asked. "Family nearby? Friends?" Margaret shook her head. "My daughter lives in Bristol. She calls on Sundays. And Mrs. Patterson next door, she knocks sometimes. But mostly it's just me." Diana nodded slowly, processing this information. She glanced at her protection officer, who stood outside the door, giving them privacy but remaining vigilant. She knew they needed to leave soon. There were schedules, protocols, security concerns. But she wasn't ready yet. Couldn't bring herself to simply walk away. "May I use your telephone?" Diana asked. Margaret gestured toward the hallway, where an old rotary phone sat on a small table. Diana picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory, her personal assistant's direct line. When the woman answered, Diana spoke quietly but with clear purpose. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. I need you to contact social services in Kent, Millbrook specifically. There's a woman here who needs support, regular check-ins, help with transportation, that sort of thing. And I want it arranged privately, through the trust. No press, no publicity. Can you handle that?" She listened to the response, then added Margaret's details and address. "Thank you. And Sarah, this is priority. I want it done by Monday." When she hung up and returned to the kitchen, Margaret was sitting at the small table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she'd apparently made while Diana was on the phone. There was a second cup waiting, steam rising from its surface. "I made you tea," Margaret said simply. "It's the least I can do." Diana sat down across from her and accepted the cup. It was strong and sweet, the kind of tea that tasted like comfort and home. They drank in companionable silence, two women sharing a moment that existed outside the normal rules of their respective worlds. "Why did you stop?" Margaret asked finally. "People drive past people like me all the time. Why were you different?" Diana considered the question carefully. She could give the easy answer, that she saw someone who needed help and simply acted. But Margaret deserved more than that. She deserved the truth. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible," Diana said slowly. "To be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. To need help but be too proud or too afraid to ask for it. I've spent so much of my life feeling that way. And I promised myself that whenever I had the chance, whenever I saw someone else feeling that way, I would stop. I would see them. Because being seen, sometimes that's the only thing that keeps us going." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You saw me," she whispered. "Yes," Diana said. "I did." They sat there for a few more minutes, finishing their tea, neither one wanting the moment to end. But eventually, Diana stood. She had to leave. The outside world was waiting, would always be waiting, demanding her presence and her energy in her carefully constructed public face. But before she left, she wrote something on a piece of paper she found by the telephone. Her personal assistant's direct number. "If you need anything," Diana said, pressing the paper into Margaret's hand. "Anything at all. Call this number and tell them I sent you. Promise me." Margaret looked at the paper, then at Diana. "I promise." They walked to the door together. Diana's protection officer was already by the car, speaking quietly into his radio. The light had faded further, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Diana turned at the threshold, looking back at Margaret one last time. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" Margaret asked, confused. "You're the one who helped me." Diana smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. "For letting me. For reminding me why this matters." She walked to the car through the increasing rain, not hurrying, letting the drops fall on her hair and shoulders. She slid into the back seat and looked back at the small house, where Margaret stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the warm light behind her, waving. As the car pulled away, Diana felt something shift inside her. It was subtle but profound, a recalibration of purpose, a remembering of what she was really here for. Not the galas or the headlines or the endless photographs. These small, sacred moments of connection. These instances when two people saw each other clearly and chose kindness. The protection officer turned slightly in his seat. That was good? What you did? Diana nodded, still looking out the window. She would have made it home eventually, she said quietly. But she shouldn't have had to struggle alone. None of us should. The countryside disappeared into the growing darkness, and the car carried her back toward London, back toward the life that waited for her there with all its complications and constraints. But Diana carried something with her now, Margaret's face, Margaret's story, Margaret's hand resting briefly on hers. She thought about all the Margaret Holloways in the world, all the people struggling quietly, fighting to maintain their dignity, trying to hold on to what mattered in the face of circumstances that conspired to take it away. She thought about how easy it was to drive past them, to look away, to pretend their struggles weren't happening just beyond the edges of our comfortable lives. And she renewed her commitment, to herself, to the memory of that moment, to every person who felt invisible, that she would keep stopping, keep seeing, keep choosing connection over convenience. Because in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered. Not titles or positions or public acclaim, but the simple, profound act of recognizing another person's humanity and responding to it with your own. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the roof of the car. Diana closed her eyes and felt grateful for the unexpected detour, for Margaret's trust, for the reminder that sometimes the most important things we do are the things no one ever sees. Somewhere behind them, in a small house with an overgrown garden and warm windows, an elderly woman was probably sitting at her kitchen table, drinking another cup of tea, trying to process what had just happened. Trying to believe that a princess had stopped her car, had carried her groceries, had sat in her kitchen and drunk her tea and seen her not as a problem to be solved but as a person worth knowing. And maybe, just maybe, Margaret was feeling a little less alone. A little more seen. A little more certain that the world still held kindness, that strangers could still be angels, that hope could still appear when you'd almost given up believing in it. If that was true, and Diana believed with everything in her that it was, then the detour had been worth it. Every minute of it. Because changing one person's day, one person's story, one person's sense of whether they mattered in this vast, often cruel world, that was everything. That was the work that would outlast everything else. The photographs would fade. The headlines would be forgotten. The controversies and scandals would eventually dissolve into historical footnotes. But Margaret would remember. She would tell her daughter about the day a princess stopped to help her. And maybe her daughter would tell her children. And maybe those children would grow up believing that kindness mattered, that stopping for strangers was worth the inconvenience, that we were all connected in ways we couldn't always see but could always choose to honor. That was the ripple effect. That was the real power, not in ruling or reigning, but in the small, sacred choice to see another person and respond with compassion. The car turned onto the motorway, accelerating into the night. Diana opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the window. She saw herself overlaid against the darkness beyond, a ghost moving through the world, leaving traces of light wherever she chose to stop. And she chose to stop, again and again. For Margaret, for all the others, for the part of herself that knew what it meant to need someone to see you. If this story moved you, share it. Let Diana's kindness continue to live through every soul it touches.